It's 5:59 in the morning. The alarm goes off. You told yourself last night, with total conviction, that you'd get up at 6 and go for a run. Nobody else knows you made that promise. Not your friends, not your boss, not one single person on this earth. And in the dark, half asleep, you hit snooze and think, just this once. No one will ever know. That's the moment we're starting with. Not the big collapse, not the dramatic failure, the small, private, completely unwitnessed moment where you quietly let yourself off the hook. Multiply that moment by 1,000 tiny versions of itself, spread across years, and you start to see the real subject of this video. It's not about mornings. It's not about workouts. It's about what happens, quietly, inside you, every time you make a promise that only you can hear, and then break it. The promise no one is grading. Here's what's strange about that snooze button moment. There's no scoreboard, no teacher marking you late, no friend waiting at the gym, checking their phone, wondering where you are. If discipline were only about external consequences, that moment should be easy. Zero stakes, zero embarrassment, zero cost. And yet, for a huge number of people, it's exactly these zero-stakes moments where they fold almost every time. Think about how differently you behave when someone else is expecting you. You show up to the coffee meeting, even if you're exhausted. You finish the report even if you'd rather not, because someone is going to ask for it. But the workout you promised only yourself, the paragraph you told only yourself you'd write, the budget you told only yourself you'd stick to, those get renegotiated in real time, with no witness and no penalty. Except that's not quite true. There is a witness. There is a penalty. The witness is you, and the penalty is paid somewhere you don't usually think to look. Most advice about self-discipline skips straight past this moment. It jumps to systems, trackers, morning routines, 5-step frameworks. But none of that addresses what's actually happening in the 2 seconds between the alarm and the snooze. Something is being decided there that has nothing to do with willpower charts or productivity apps. Something is being recorded, and once you can see what's being recorded, the whole conversation about discipline changes shape. And it's not just the alarm. It's the moment you tell yourself you'll check your spending tonight, and tonight quietly becomes never. It's the hard email you promised yourself you'd answer first thing, sliding to tomorrow, then to next week. Each of these has the exact same shape as the snooze button. Private, low stakes, unwitnessed, which means each one is doing the exact same quiet work, whether or not you're paying attention to it. So here's the question worth sitting with before we go further. If nobody's grading that moment, what exactly is being measured, and who's keeping score? It's not the missed rep, it's the message. Here's the reframe. When you skip the run, the actual cost isn't the missed workout. One missed run doesn't change your body. One skipped budget check-in doesn't bankrupt you. The physical cost of breaking a small promise to yourself is, on its own, almost nothing. If that were the whole story, none of this would matter. But your brain isn't just tracking outcomes. It's tracking patterns. Every time you say, I'll do this and then don't, some quiet internal process logs a data point. My word doesn't reliably predict my behavior. Not I'm lazy. Not I failed today. Something colder and more structural, a small update to your internal model of yourself, filed away without ceremony. One data point doesn't mean much, but you're not filing one. You're filing hundreds, maybe thousands, over the years. Every snoozed alarm, every I'll start Monday, every abandoned tab of a course you were definitely going to finish. And a brain that has logged enough of those data points starts to treat them as a baseline expectation. Not, I might not follow through this time. Just, I don't follow through. That's who this person is. That belief doesn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives quietly. The way sediment builds on a riverbed, and by the time you notice it's there, it's already shaping the shape of the river. This is why the same person can read every productivity book on the market and still stall out in the same place. They're treating the problem as a lack of information, what to do, what app to use, what schedule to follow. But the actual deficit isn't informational. It's a credibility gap with yourself. You already know what to do. The question underneath is whether you believe you'll do it. And that belief is built or destroyed by exactly the kind of moment we just described, not by anything written in a book. It also explains a very specific kind of tiredness a lot of people carry without naming it. The fatigue of setting the same goal for the 5th year running. That fatigue usually isn't really about the goal itself. It's the weight of a ledger that already has an answer written into it before you've even started, because it's read this exact pattern too many times before. Here's a small experiment worth trying before we go on. Think back over the last week and count how many times you told yourself, privately, that you'd do something small and then quietly didn't. Most people can't even remember, because the moments were too small to register as failures. That's exactly the point. They were too small to register and too frequent not to matter. If the message is what's really being recorded, the next question writes itself. Why does that message land so much harder when the promise was only ever made to you? Why promises to yourself break easier than promises to others? So why does this asymmetry exist? Why is it so much easier to bail on yourself than to bail on someone else? It's tempting to call it weakness, but that's not quite it. It's closer to a design flaw in how promises work. A promise to a friend comes wrapped in stakes you can feel. If you cancel on someone, there's a real cost. An awkward text, a flicker of embarrassment, maybe a small dent in how they see you. Your brain is exceptionally good at weighing social cost. It's one of the oldest systems we've got, tuned over a very long evolutionary history to care intensely about reputation, because reputation used to be the difference between belonging to the group and being left outside it. A promise to yourself carries none of that machinery. There's no one to disappoint. In a way, your nervous system registers as dangerous. No one clocks the missed run. No one drafts a slightly cooler opinion of you at the group chat. Without an external enforcer, the promise simply gets deprioritized. Not because you don't care, but because the part of your brain that ranks priorities was never built to treat unwitnessed commitments as urgent. It's not a character flaw. It's a structural gap. This is worth pausing on, because it changes the tone of the whole conversation. If the pattern were really about weakness, the fix would be to try harder, feel more ashamed, push more forcefully next time. But if it's structural, the fix looks completely different. You're not missing grit. You're missing the internal equivalent of a friend who'd notice if you didn't show up. Once you see it as structural, you stop needing to explain it away with self-blame, and you can go looking for a way to close the gap instead. There's a practical implication buried in this too. Since your brain isn't going to spontaneously treat a private promise as urgent, waiting to feel like keeping it is a losing strategy, the feeling of urgency was never going to show up on its own, because nothing in the moment is built to produce it. You have to supply the seriousness yourself on purpose before the feeling ever arrives. That gap turns out to have a name and a body of research behind it that reaches back almost 50 years. The self-efficacy mechanism. There's a well-known piece of psychology that explains exactly why this gap matters so much. And it comes from the psychologist Albert Bandura. In 1977, Bandura published a theory of what he called self-efficacy, your belief in your own capability to actually do the things you set out to do. And his central finding was this: that belief isn't built primarily through encouragement, pep talks, or good intentions. It's built through what he called mastery experiences. Direct, lived proof that you have, in fact, done the thing before. Read that carefully, because it reorganizes everything we've talked about so far. A kept promise to yourself isn't just a nice bonus on top of the outcome. It is, quite literally, the raw material your brain uses to construct the belief that you're capable. And a broken promise isn't just a missed task, it's raw material too, just for the opposite belief. Every single time you follow through on something small, you are manufacturing evidence. Every time you don't, you're manufacturing the opposite kind. This is why motivation alone so often fails to produce change. Motivation is a feeling. Self-efficacy is a belief built from a track record. You can feel extremely motivated on a Sunday night and still fail on Tuesday morning, because motivation was never the thing standing between you and the run. A shaky internal record of your own follow-through was. Once you understand that mastery experiences are the actual currency here, the whole project shifts from get more motivated to something much more concrete. Go collect proof. It also explains something that confuses a lot of people about confidence. Confident people aren't confident because they were born with some extra reserve of self-belief. Most of them built it the boring way, one completed thing at a time, until the evidence pile got tall enough to lean on. Confidence isn't the starting condition, it's the output. For a long time, though, the dominant explanation for why people don't follow through pointed somewhere else entirely, at willpower itself, running out like fuel in a tank. Why just being more disciplined misses the point. For decades, there was a popular explanation for why people fail to follow through, and it went something like this. Willpower is a limited resource, like a battery that drains over the course of the day. Make enough decisions, resist enough temptations, and by evening you're running on fumes, which is why the promise you made to yourself in the morning falls apart by dinner. This idea, often called ego depletion, came out of research by Baumeister and colleagues in 1998, and it spread everywhere because it matched how exhausted everyone already felt. Here's the complication. In 2016, a large team of researchers led by Hagger ran a massive multi-lab effort to replicate the ego depletion effect. Many independent labs, the same experimental protocol, a huge combined sample, and the effect essentially failed to replicate. The battery drain model of willpower, at least in the clean form it was originally proposed, didn't hold up under that level of scrutiny. Now, this doesn't mean fatigue and stress don't matter. Of course they do. But it knocks out the tidy explanation a lot of people have been leaning on. I didn't go for the run because my willpower tank was empty. If willpower isn't simply a fuel gauge ticking down, then the pattern of broken promises can't be fully explained by exhaustion alone. Something else is doing the damage, and based on everything we just covered, that something looks a lot more like an eroding sense of self-trust than a drained battery. This matters practically, not just academically. If you believe the tank metaphor, the only lever you have is rest, and rest alone rarely fixes a pattern of broken promises. But if the real mechanism is trust, the lever is completely different, and it's one you can pull starting today, regardless of how tired you are. You don't need to run out of fuel to stop believing your own word. You just need enough broken promises stacked up behind you, and you don't need to refill a tank to start reversing it either. If it's not fuel that's being spent, then something else is being built or torn down with every single promise. Every promise is a vote for identity. So if it's not fuel, what is it building or tearing down? This is where the idea gets sharper. Every time you keep or break a small promise to yourself, you're not just producing an outcome. You're casting a vote for who you believe you are. This idea of identity-based habits was popularized by James Clear in Atomic Habits, and it reframes the entire project in a useful way. The goal was never really the finish line. The goal was always a proxy for the identity underneath it. When you finish the 10-minute writing session you promised yourself, you're not just producing 300 words. You're casting a vote for, I am someone who follows through on what I say. When you skip it, you're casting a vote for the opposite. I am someone who talks about things and doesn't do them. No single vote decides the election. But elections aren't won on one vote. They're won on the accumulated pattern, and your self-concept works exactly the same way. This is why chasing outcomes alone so often stalls out. You can hit a goal and still not trust yourself. If you cut corners and cheated your way there. And you can miss a goal and still deepen your self-trust if you showed up honestly and did the work you said you would, even when the result fell short. The scoreboard everyone's watching is the outcome. The scoreboard that actually determines whether you keep showing up is the identity ledger running quietly underneath it. It also explains why some people can hit an impressive goal and still feel hollow afterward. They won the outcome and lost the vote. They got the result through shortcuts, borrowed effort, or luck, and some part of them knows the identity ledger wasn't actually updated. The applause was real. The evidence wasn't. Not everyone who fails to start is casting a clear vote either way, though. Some people vote against themselves so slowly and so elegantly that it doesn't even look like failure. The elaborate planner who never starts. Now for a character a lot of people will recognize, maybe uncomfortably. This is the person who builds the most beautiful habit tracker you've ever seen. They compare 5 different productivity apps for a weekend, color code categories, design a system with tiers and streaks and a whole aesthetic. They read about the perfect morning routine, and they are always starting next Monday. On the surface, this looks like the opposite of the promise breaker from Chapter 1. This person is clearly disciplined, clearly organized, clearly taking the goal seriously. But look closer, and the planning itself has become the disguise. Researching a 5th app feels productive. It creates the sensation of progress without the risk of the real thing. Because as long as the system isn't finished, you never actually have to test whether you'll follow through on it. And here's the part that connects back to everything so far. I'll start next Monday is itself a promise. And when Monday arrives, and the elaborate system gets pushed to the Monday after that, it's not a neutral delay. It's another entry in the ledger, another small promise made and quietly broken, dressed up in a costume of productivity, so it doesn't feel like what it is. The tracker was never the problem. The infinite runway before using it was. The tell is almost always the same. Ask this person how the system is going, and they'll describe the system in detail, the categories, the color codes, the streak counters, but rarely the actual behavior it was supposed to produce. That gap between how fluently someone can describe their plan and how little they can say about their doing is usually the clearest sign the plan has quietly become the substitute for the thing itself. If planning can disguise a broken promise this well, it's worth asking what happens when the promise is enormous instead of well disguised. Big promises versus tiny ones. Here's a contrast worth sitting with. On one side, the New Year's resolution, I'm going to write a book this year. Big, bold, exciting to announce. On the other side, something almost embarrassingly small. I'll write for 10 minutes today. No one's impressed by that at a dinner party. The instinct is to think the big promise is somehow more serious, more real, more worth making. But look at the actual failure rates. Big promises fail constantly, and not because people don't want them badly enough. They fail because the bar is so high that almost any life friction knocks you off it. A busy week, a bad month, a change in circumstances, and the book-in-a-year promise is dead by March. Here's the part most people miss. Failing at a high bar teaches your brain the exact same lesson as failing at a low one. The size of the promise doesn't protect your self-trust when it breaks. It just makes the eventual break more expensive, more public, more likely to come with a side of shame. A 10-minute promise, on the other hand, is almost impossible to fail. And an almost impossible to fail promise, kept honestly and repeatedly, builds exactly the mastery experience Bandura was talking about, cheaply, reliably, without the dramatic collapse. This isn't an argument against ambition. It's an argument about sequencing. Ambition, without a track record underneath it, is building on sand. But ambition, sitting on top of 100 kept tiny promises, is building on something that's already been tested and held. The book in a year and the 10-minute daily promise aren't actually rivals. The second one is how the first one survives contact with a bad week. Which brings us to idea underneath everything we've covered so far, stated as plainly as possible. Discipline is a relationship, not a resource. This is the core reframe the whole video has been building toward, so let's say it directly. Most advice treats self-discipline like a resource, something you have more or less of, something you can top up with motivation, caffeine, or a good playlist. That framing is wrong, or at least incomplete, and it sets people up to keep failing in the same way. Because a resource problem and a trust problem call for completely different solutions. Try this instead. Treat your relationship with yourself the same way you'd treat a relationship with another person. If a friend told you they'd show up and then canceled, repeatedly, without much of an excuse, you'd stop believing their word. Not because you decided to be cynical, but because trust is earned through a track record, and theirs had gone empty. Your relationship with yourself works on exactly the same mechanics. Every broken promise withdraws from the account. Every kept one deposits into it. There's no interest paid on good intentions, only on what actually got done. This is genuinely good news, even though it doesn't feel like it at first. If discipline were a fixed resource, something you either have or you don't, you'd be stuck with whatever you were handed. But a relationship can be rebuilt. Slowly, unglamorously, one kept commitment at a time. The same way trust gets rebuilt between two people after it's been damaged. You are not out of discipline. You are, more likely, out of recent evidence that your word means something. Those are very different problems, and only one of them has a real path forward. It also means the language people use against themselves is usually pointed at the wrong target. I'm so undisciplined treats the problem as a permanent trait. I haven't given myself much reason to trust me lately treats it as a repairable history. Only one of those two sentences gives you somewhere to go next. So what does the actual repair work look like in practice, starting from wherever the ledger currently sits? Promises you almost can't fail. So here's the practical pivot, and it follows directly from everything Bandura's research suggests. If mastery experiences are what rebuilds self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is what makes the next promise easier to keep, then the fastest way to rebuild trust with yourself is to deliberately shrink the promises until failure is almost impossible. Not I'll work out for an hour, 2 push-ups. Not I'll write a chapter, 1 sentence. Not I'll overhaul my finances. Open the banking app and look at one number. These sound too small to matter, and that's exactly the point. The outcome isn't the goal here. The completed action is the goal, because the completed action is the deposit. You're not training your biceps with 2 push-ups. You're training your belief that when you say you'll do something, you do it. There's a trap worth naming here. The promise has to be honest. If you set the bar low specifically so you can feel good without really trying, some part of you will register that too. You can't con your own ledger. The point isn't a loophole. It's a promise so achievable that breaking it would take active avoidance, which makes keeping it a near certainty, which is exactly what turns it into reliable proof. Stack enough of those and something shifts that's hard to describe until you've felt it. The 10-minute promise stops feeling risky. Eventually, the hour doesn't feel impossible either. Not because willpower increased, but because the evidence changed what you believe about yourself. The size of the promise you can trust yourself with grows at exactly the pace the ledger allows, no faster, and trying to rush that pace is usually what breaks it again. There's one more mistake worth flagging before this becomes a checklist you can actually use, because it's the mistake that looks the most like progress. The outsourcing trap. One warning before we get to the payoff, because this next mistake is easy to make with the best intentions. Accountability apps that fine you for missed workouts. Public commitments posted online. Coaches who check in every week. These tools are everywhere, and they can genuinely help as scaffolding. The trap is using them as a permanent substitute instead. If the only reason you show up is that an app will charge your card or a coach will ask about it, you haven't actually built the internal muscle this whole video has been describing. You've just rented an external one, and rented muscle disappears the moment you stop paying for it. Cancel the app, lose the coach, and the follow-through often disappears right along with the enforcement mechanism, because the underlying trust in your own word was never actually built. It was borrowed. That doesn't mean never use these tools. Scaffolding is genuinely useful while a building is going up. The distinction is whether you're using external accountability to get momentum started while you quietly build your own track record underneath it, or whether you're using it because some part of you has already decided you can't be trusted, and outsourcing feels safer than finding out. One is a bridge. The other is a hiding place. A simple test for which one you're doing. Imagine the app deleted and the coach gone tomorrow. If the honest answer is that the habit collapses instantly, the tool was carrying weight that belonged to you. If the honest answer is that it would sting but survive, the scaffolding did its job and can start coming down. There's also a quieter version of this trap that doesn't involve any app at all. Borrowing someone else's belief in you instead of building your own. A partner who cheers you on, a parent who's proud of you, a friend who says you've got this can feel like enough fuel to run on for a while. It isn't a bad thing to have. But it was never a substitute for the evidence only you can generate. And it tends to run out exactly when you need it most, on the days nobody's watching and nobody's cheering. Get this part right, and the payoff isn't confined to the gym or the desk. It shows up in places that look, at first glance, completely unrelated. The compounding payoff. Here's where the private ledger stops being private in its effects, even if it stays private in its process. Look at the people who negotiate the raise, who actually stick to the savings plan for years instead of months, who take the real career risk instead of the safe default. It's tempting to assume they're simply more talented, more confident by nature, wired differently. Mostly, they're not. What they usually have is a longer track record of proof, small, boring, unglamorous proof, accumulated over years, that when they say they'll do something, they do it. That's not a personality trait. It's closer to a compounding interest rate on a currency that never shows up on a bank statement. The person who negotiates the raise isn't drawing confidence from nowhere. They're drawing it from the accumulated weight of every 10-minute promise they kept when nobody was watching. Notice, too, what this means for the people around you, even though the ledger is private. Someone who trusts their own word tends to make commitments to other people more carefully and keep them more reliably, because the private practice and the public practice are drawing from the exact same account. The self-trust was never really separate from the trust other people end up placing in you. It was the source of it, which means the raise, the savings plan, the career risk were never really the finish line either. They were just the moment the private ledger finally became visible from the outside. So here's what's worth carrying out of this video. Somewhere in the next day or two, there's going to be another one of those private, unwitnessed moments, an alarm, a deadline, a small commitment that only you know about. Notice it when it arrives. You don't need to overhaul your life to change what happens next. You just need to keep the smallest version of that promise on purpose and let it count. That's the whole method. Start there and let the ledger do the rest.